Hello, everyone. Thank you, everybody who is here today for our event. This is fantastic to see a full house for Michael Antfield and Vanessa Brown. My name is Josh Lombier. I'm the Artistic Director of the Words Festival. And it is so satisfying to see everybody back after 2 years being online for a full house. I would also like to welcome the 100 people who are on our stream right now. So there's 100 people viewing from home as well. And we are so pleased that we could welcome you to London from wherever you are. I think we asked where people are from. Somebody from Los Angeles is joining us. So this is a fantastic opportunity to bring people from all over. And of course, people from all over Canada. We love the fact that we can do an event like this and bring in people from all over. That's one of the silver linings of the pandemic. Words went into the pandemic as a scrappy, up-and-coming regional literary and creative arts festival, and we came out on the other side emerging as a national festival with an audience from just about everywhere. So that's something that we wanted to keep with us. So that's the camera folks at the back of the room. Okay, so I would like to welcome, and I'm going to turn things over in a second to Vanessa Brown, who has lived her entire life here in London, Ontario. Her previous books include The Grand Old Lady, A History of Hotel London, and London 150 Cultural Moments, which was honored by the Ontario Heritage Trust. She's married to Canadian poet Jason Dixon, and together they own Brown and Dixon Booksellers, and Jason's here with us tonight. Two very integral people of our community. And of course, Vanessa's books are on sale tonight, as well as Michael's. So a note in advance too, at the end of the event, and I'll come back and remind everybody of this, we're gonna let Jason, I've got Jason on my mind, Michael and Vanessa to leave the room to go upstairs to get their books signed, and rather than having everybody come to the front of the room, and it'll be on the floor where the bookstore is, up at the second floor. And so we'll just let them get out of the room before we end the event. So I'm going to turn things over to Vanessa, who I have to thank for this event. Vanessa emailed me in the summer and said that she wanted to do an event after doing an event at the bookstore with Michael. And we were thrilled to have them back. I think the year before we had the pandemic, you both joined us. So this is a wonderful part two to that conversation. I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa.
Thank you. Is this working? Oh my God. I didn't even have to press a button. Hi, everybody. Hello. Hi. I would like to point out that my husband did also co-author the London 150 book with me. That's right. So thank you, everyone. This is Mike Antfield. You all know who that is, right? Give him a hand. So I didn't write like a professional introduction for you. Of course, I've read all your books. How many books do you have out now? 12. Oh, his mic's not working. Can we fix that? 12. He said 12. That's a lot of books. I thought I had a lot, but no, that's very impressive. Oh. Okay, and we'll just keep going. All right, well, Mike's also a professor at Western and works with the Murder Accountability Project in the States. You may also remember his television show on Oxygen and a whole bunch of other things. You're sort of a star, a local celeb. So good work, Mike. Now, of course, I found out about you in 2015 when your book Murder City was published. And growing up in London, I became a bit of a local history nut in high school. I had a teacher, Winston Schell, who was a local publisher, poet, and folk singer. And he sent me over to the London Room to learn about London's art history. So I learned all about the regionalists and London in the 1960s, and that sent me down the rabbit hole for local history. It's interesting, the London regionalists, the 1960s, an amazing time for London's art and creativity. But then your book came out, and I found out it was also London's darkest period, where we had more serial killers per capita than any other place on record in, was it Ontario?
Globally, actually.
Oh, globally,
So it's
right.
slightly larger than Ontario. And again, this is based on the available data. So most G7 nations have reliable mortality data by homicide. We're going to be getting into a little bit of that today because since then, what people I think thought they know about those trends, about those rates, is largely false, particularly in the U.S. And we don't know in Canada. I've got a whole section on this in my new book because StatsCan won't tell us. So,
Yeah.
citing privacy of offenders, privacy of the deceased. They get to decide in their annual reports, if you go to StatsCan, what you should deem criminologically significant, not the criminologist. So handgun violence is up 12% in Saskatoon since last year. So take that at face value. Don't ask questions about what else is going on.
Yikes. Well, this information, of course, is among lots of other factoids and basically an incredible thesis project that Mike has written in his latest book, How to Solve a Cold Case, which I got my hands on this summer. Did it come out this summer?
June. Yep.
June, yeah, and immediately read. And again, like all of his books, read it in about 2 days. Would have been one if I didn't have kids. So yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about here today, and of course in relationship to the London cases as well. So let's talk about that, Mike. Now, first of all, I want to ask you about true crime and genre. Now, you teach at Western, you teach crime writing, both fiction and nonfiction, right?
True crime as its own, yeah.
Yeah, so
genre.
you're a scholar, though, when it comes to crime fiction, horror fiction, gothic fiction. You've written about those as well. So can I ask you, how does your interest and what you've come to understand about the genre of fictional crime writing, how does that connect with your work in true crime? How does that influence you as a writer?
Well, there's something I coined literary criminology, which is you can study crime through stats upon stats and case studies and the scholarship, which is all very valuable. But a lot of the same information can be found in a narrative form in both literary nonfiction and fiction. In one of my books, Gothic Forensics, I look at, for instance, most of the police technologies, forensic methodologies that we take for granted today were first conceptualized in works of 19th century fiction. Fingerprinting, handwriting analysis, suspectology, victimology, these were all conceptualized as fictional constructs and then eventually get picked up into the real world, not unlike the way science fiction influences things like the US space program, clearly. So true crime, though, is a little bit different. I'm not sure when the term true crime was coined. If you look at the Edgar Awards, which are the long-standing awards for achievement in mystery writing, they would always call, or always have called, that category of award for literary nonfiction fact crime. And it seems that someone, as soon as that valve was turned and fact crime became true crime, and that has a little bit more of a catch to it, it's become this part of the zeitgeist now, a cultural phenomenon. But as I explained in my last book, I've identified 4 separate waves of true crime since about the 1850s, and they ebb and flow. And I think we're sort of seeing the current 4th wave fizzle out, or at least recede a little bit, because of the same economic and global forces that led the last 3 iterations of true crime to sort of phase into something else. It's not as interesting to consume yourself with death and psychopaths and mysteries and the pain of others when the very visceral realities of a recession and war in Europe and other factors that come bearing down. So we've seen this in the past, whereby those changes in global events often lead to true crime sort of being usurped by the next big thing.
Usurped maybe by some fictions coming up. Interesting. But your books aren't particularly, there are true crime elements, but I wouldn't call them traditional true. I mean, that's where they'd get shelved at chapters, but it's not like you pick up a Mike Antfield book and it's about one case and one story. You're more interested in analysis.
So yeah, I would like to consider my books literary criminology. So I'm teaching criminological principles through nonfiction stories, so through actual events. There's a little bit, again, of social history in these books, but I guess they're best explained or characterized as what I would call didactic criminology. So a didactic narrative is any story that subtly imparts some kind of factual or moral lesson. So as you're reading these sordid stories, I'm actually telling you or explaining subtly, there's no such thing as actually a burglary gone wrong. And people, teens who break into a residential home to steal liquor and a Xbox, when the occupant comes home, don't savagely murder and mutilate them. So that whole theory makes absolutely no sense and never has. So let's move away from that. So I tell the story of the crime and then explain why everything you think you thought you knew about that is bunk.
That's really interesting. I noticed when I was reading your book that you do explore specific stories, and I know you're particularly fond in your book and on your podcast, Suspect Zero, as well, of highlighting stories that don't get as much attention in the broader media. And so in the experience of reading it, I'm learning about those stories, but you really are tackling a greater issue at hand. I'm just going to refer to my notes. When you talk about cold cases, can you tell us what defines a cold case in regards to your research?
So a lot of people ask that. The term cold case actually has no legal or forensic standing. It's largely a media conceptualization, and it has a good ring to it. But it's essentially an unresolved case. So think about cold is unresolved. And the definition used by most homicide scholars is, the consensus is that you really only need 3 criteria. Number one, the case has not seen an active material change, so an update to the investigative chronology, a new interview, etc., in 12 months. Number 2, the investigator originally assigned to the case is no longer attached to it by dint of retirement, death, transfer to another unit, etc. So there's a loss of institutional continuity. And number 3, there's no outstanding expert reports or lab analyses to be completed. You're not waiting on ballistic tests, DNA tests, impression pattern matching, anything like that. So you can see, using that very simple criteria, a case can be cold in 13 months by definition. And of course, the linchpin to this is unresolved, meaning that it has not been cleared or closed. And by clearing a case, that means the police service delivers essentially a finding, not only internally, but to the federal government that is supposed to keep track of this stuff. And so the Government Statistics Canada, the Canadian Centre for Justice Statistics, will recognize there was an incident, say a homicide incident in London on such and such a date, and it is either uncleared at the time that that information is sent to them, or it's been cleared. And you can clear by charge, which is what usually happens, or you can clear by other means, which has become important in Canada recently in terms of some cold cases. I'm thinking specifically of Christine Jessup, where Calvin Hoover was identified as her actual murderer, not Guy Paul Morin, obviously, which Canadians, I think, have agreed upon for years, and certainly the courts did. But that case is cleared by other means, and the other mean is that he's deceased, so he can't get his day in court. But that is officially now resolved. So that someone throws a switch, essentially, and both at the Toronto Police Service that now has that case, and at StatsCan, it goes from uncleared to cleared.
Okay, so you'd think, no.
That's as easy as I can.
No, that's fine. I thank you for explaining it. And I think a lot of people assume that a case is cleared when someone's arrested. So it is good to know that police can clear a crime without an arrest being made or without any justice, frankly. We know that there are so many stories of historic cases. We've just been rewatching Mindhunter and, of course, the Atlanta child murders. So many families never had justice because the courts simply just didn't prosecute the other cases. The same thing happened with all the, of course, I'm sorry, Bundy cases in the Pacific Northwest. We were joking about how there are so many, everyone just loves to talk about him, but so many families don't get justice because charges aren't pursued. Of course, we live in a world with lots of technology, DNA testing, science, the internet. You'd assume that it would be really hard to get away with a murder now, but can you explain what this is? What's that?
So at the Murder Accountability Project, I'll give you a brief snapshot of what we do. We are a not-for-profit based in Washington, D.C., and in fact, the most accurate and comprehensive database for homicides in the United States is not at the FBI or the Justice Department. It's on a home server in a closet in Alexandria, Virginia, where the chairman of the Murder Accountability Project lives. We have scraped, compiled, and built up the most comprehensive data set anywhere in the world. And what we're seeing here is when we look at really since the inception of the Uniform Crime Reporting Program in 1929. This is the standardized way that the government captures homicide data in the US. The who, what, where, when, why, and how. All this information is reported to the federal government, is supposed to be. Only about 60% of police departments historically have done this. So we've gone and found the other 40% who are non-compliant, and we get their information directly and we add it all up. And what we see is there are more, well, you can see for yourself. The clearance rate, the solved rate, has been declining precipitously since the program came into effect. In 2020, which you see on the far right bottom side of the graph, marked the lowest point in history. Nationally speaking in the US, whether a murder is solved or not, or goes cold, is a coin toss, 1 in 2. In some cities, as much as 80% of homicides are going uncleared. So this isn't an arrest being made, someone prosecuted, the charges being dropped, the person being acquitted. 1 in 2 cases nationally, no suspect ever identified by the time this occurrence is reported to the Justice Department, which is usually around 72 hours. And in some cities, even worse than that, where 3 in 10 murderers will be caught, the rest are free to keep doing what they're doing. So there's a lot of ways to interpret this.
Can I ask you, before we interpret this, this is American data.
Yeah.
So why don't we have Canadian data? And what would your guess on that Canadian data be?
Well, based on what StatsCan will tell us, 2020 also marked the lowest in Canadian history. We're not at 50%, but rather than, it's typically around 74, 75%, it was around 65%. So that's not an insignificant drop. And we have far fewer homicides per capita than in the United States. So despite the fact we only have a fraction of the US murder problem, we fare marginally better in solving them, nationally speaking. And we don't have one of these in Canada. I got a grant several years ago to build a Murder Accountability Project Canada. With partnership with Murder Accountability in the US, and the required data, the granular data, the who, what, where, when, why, how type of information with the names removed, just date of death, cause of death, age of victim, weapon used, suspected motive, privacy. Can't give you that. You can't be making that publicly known. You can't publish this about what's happened in Canada.
Because it's horrifying, right? I mean, we're all sitting here thinking that's horrifying. How can we live in a world with all of this science, all this technology, all of these tools to solve crimes, and we're not even solving half of them?
Well, there's that, and yeah, but you can use privacy as an all-encompassing cudgel, basically, to ward off anyone who may be willing to make you look bad. We're not trying to make anybody look bad. This is completely neutral, unvarnished data, just that people can interpret the way they want.
Yeah, here's another chart from the Murder Accountability Project. That's the opposite, right? Showing us the failure to clear homicides. So I wanted to ask you, these are some numbers. I don't know about you, but I'm not a numbers person. I don't do the taxes in our family. If you hand me a contract, I'm very likely to sign it without reading it because my eyes just glaze right over. Don't take advantage of that, please. So when I see numbers like this, okay, don't get confused. Let's start from the beginning. Mike, can you tell me, what are the missing murdered or the missing? Can you tell me what those terms mean?
So missing murders. So I'll give you an example. There's a term in criminology called the dark figure of crime, and it suggests that 2/3 of crime remains dark to law enforcement and statisticians. It's never reported. Like an iceberg, you only see the tip of the problem. 2/3 of it is below the surface. And you can think of reasons why that might make sense. You come out in the morning and you don't park your car in the garage, and some punk kid has rummaged through your car and taken your sunglasses and change. You're going to call the London Police Service to report this? Is that worth your while? Or are you going to remember to lock your car next time? Technically, a crime has occurred: theft, mischief, probably trespassing by night if it's parked in a residential laneway. So 3 crimes have occurred. They are never reported. They never become known. So that's one person. If 10 people on that street have the same interaction, that's now 30 crimes going unreported. You can start to see how this becomes significant. This is one street in one city in one province. Nationally speaking, how much crime is being lost to indifference, frustration, a lack of trust, but that's a car break-in. You would think it would be very difficult to not report or make a murder disappear, or for a murder to become not known to law enforcement or the government. And we see from a study that we did, again, based on the fact that we have the richest data at the Murder Accountability Project, we came up with an idea. We thought, and I'll get into how this became a thing in Ontario after this. We know that there's a lot of, because we see this happening with serial killers. I'll go back to a case from Murder City. Russell Johnson, the bedroom strangler, his first 2 victims were misclassified as accidental deaths, despite the fact he had vaulted the exteriors of their buildings, climbed in their balcony windows, strangled them, posed their bodies, spooned with the corpses, and then deep cleaned their apartments. None of this was apparently known to anybody, but by sheer coincidence, both victims were on some same obscure medication that can lead to positional asphyxia when you're asleep. So that's what they thought happened. So that's one killer in one case in one city, and you had 2 murders be misclassified, so they went missing. Murders that went missing, those are missing murders. So we thought, let's look at annual data in the United States. Every murder reported as a homicide by police departments to the FBI. And again, I told you it's voluntary. But we've gone around and plugged all the holes and found all the departments, mostly in Kentucky and Ohio, that just refuse to provide data to the federal government. So we have those and we lump them all together. So we have a certain set of numbers. So for instance, you see here in 2018, through the Uniform Crime Reporting System, various police services reported 15,877 murders to the federal government. But there's another government agency now that everybody knows because of the pandemic, the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, the CDC. Every death in America is reported to the CDC that maintains strict trends on, or strict statistics on mortality data. And one of the boxes ticked on death certificates is homicide. So consistently every year we see the CDC physicians are identifying about 2,500 more people murdered or whose cause of death is homicide than are being recognized by police as homicides, and the records never get married up.
So there are thousands of people who are murdered every year, and it's not identified as a murder.
There's suspects walking around, and they're not suspects in any crime because that crime has never, a report has never been made for that homicide.
Now, of course, this intersects with racism. So there is a section in your book where you give an example of one geographic area in the United States where the indigenous population, it was something like 80% of the murders were misclassified.
We see this tends to cluster in certain areas where policing is just slipshod, or where, yes, there is a overrepresented minority group who seems to be bearing the brunt of this trend. In Ontario, this is actually has been recognized as a major issue, and it wasn't because of our work in the U.S., but there was I don't know who's heard of this case, the Robinson family in Mississauga, which was a husband and wife and their adult son, all living in a detached home in Mississauga. And over a 3-year period, a serial killer came back and systematically exterminated every single member of that family in separate incidents. And the first two were ruled, so the father was murdered first, that was ruled natural. The mother was murdered a year later, that was ruled accidental. And the killer has to be thinking, well, no one's even looking for me. These aren't even in the news. What's going on? So he goes back a third time, kills the son, who's now living in the home by himself. And there's a struggle, and by the time the police get there, it's clearly a homicide. So then they say, maybe we should go back and look at the other two people that have died in this house under mysterious circumstances in the last 2 years. So the chief coroner opened an inquiry into missing murders in Ontario. He's thinking, this is one house, one family, how many more are there? They undertook a review of cases where the cause of death was in dispute, and they officially reopened a case of a Strathroy boy who was actually going to the Royal Military College in Kingston, Joe Grosel. So that was reopened as now a homicide and is being investigated as a homicide after lobbying by the family who came to our group here at Western first, and we wrote up a report for them saying, yeah, this is not an accident or undetermined. Undetermined is the most dreadful classification or manner of death that can be ascribed to a case, because it basically means both the coroner and the police aren't sure. They don't really want to look into it further, so they're just going to file it under you for undetermined and move on. And those cases, it's the death knell for a case. It will stay in purgatory under that classification until someone comes along with new evidence or with an expert analysis saying, yeah, this person was missing for like a week and had undigested contents in their stomach, only a few hours old, and you say that they killed themselves like a month ago. None of this makes sense. So that's been reopened. And so this is not just a US phenomenon. Again, can we get this data here to see how big a problem this is in Canada? No, because the government is not forthcoming, because they say that, well, even if we provide you anonymized data, an 8-year-old with an internet connection can probably find the names of some of these victims through archived media reports, and therefore do what with it, I don't know. But
Be informed.
yeah. God forbid.
God forbid. And of course, this topic is so intersectional on so many levels. We could go into the concept of the less dead, which, if you're not aware, it's the idea that basically anyone that's not a pretty white girl who is murdered is of zero interest to the media and becomes of less interest to law enforcement. So people of color, trans individuals, all sorts of, anyone who's not a pretty white girl basically gets ignored. And that, of course, contributes to the missing murdered and the missing as well, which is, I will switch over. I just thought of, we'll get to that in a second. Because, of course, in the London cases, and when I was researching the London cases, I kept finding all the time, and it's amazing, because there's a whole bunch of boomers that if you ask them about the 60s will tell you it was the most magical, beautiful time ever. And if you read the newspaper, it's a very different story. Historical research requires reading a lot of microfiche, and your eyes start to get crossed when you're looking through it all. But I did encounter a lot of missing persons, a lot of missing young people in the newspaper, and I would write down their names and then Google it and not find anything and think, oh, they must have found them, or who knows what happened. And I'm sure they did find some of them, but there are people who just go missing as well who are murdered.
Well, there is, and there's also people who go missing that nobody knows they're missing, and this is the missing. These are people who are so on the margins that they don't have a job to go to, so that when they don't show up, the boss doesn't wonder what happened to them. They don't have family regularly checking in on them. So many times when I was a police officer, we would only determine that somebody was dead in their apartment and had been missing for some time, because the accumulation of junk mail outside their door became an annoyance to the neighbors who called that in. And at that time, police still responded to that, or it was deemed suspicious. So we go, and yeah, they've been dead for weeks, and nobody, until it became a visual nuisance, nobody bothered to care. What's terrifying about that concept of the missing, number one, is you will never be able to quantify how many of these people are out there, because that's the whole point. There's no record of their having gone missing. You would have to proactively check in with every single person registered in the census to say, are you alive and well, which isn't going to happen. But in the book, I provide a very recent terrifying example of how I think society has gotten so cynical and withdrawn that it can happen to just about anybody. And it's a tragic but fascinating story, and I'll give you the brief version. In Waterloo, a young man is sentenced to a brief prison sentence for impaired driving causing bodily harm. His mother and teenage sister visit him fastidiously while he's in custody weekly, make sure he's doing all right, and all of a sudden their visits stop. He paroles out about 6 months later, goes to meet with his parole officer, whose job is to onboard him back into being a productive member of society. And he says, how's everything going? How's your relationship with your family? And the convict says, it's really weird. Like, they just stopped visiting me. So parole officer says, well, why don't you go knock on their door? So he sort of sheepishly goes to where they're living and where he grew up, the family home, knocks on the door, and a complete stranger answers the door. And he says, where's my mom and my sister? And the guy says, I have no idea what you're talking about. I bought this house about a year ago from another man. So now things are looking fishy. So he goes back to the parole officer and says, yeah, they've moved. They just pulled up stakes and obviously sold to somebody else who sold to this current guy. I have no idea what to do. Incredibly, the parole officer knows that something is wrong. His instincts tell him something's wrong. He calls the police. He says, I don't know what to make of this, but something's gone wrong, and these are the two people who should be living there. Long story short, what they find out is they get what's called a general warrant under the criminal code, which is basically a catch-all. Like, so you're not searching a place, you don't really know what you're looking for, but you know that there's maybe evidence somewhere. So they get a warrant to walk on this property with a cadaver dog, as though someone's out walking their dog at night, and the dog indicates at a tree, where then they get a warrant to search the property, and they find the burned remains of the mother and the daughter. The next, what they realize is the mother was murdered, a new deed for the home forged by the murderer, who is her boyfriend. He then sold the home to the new occupant and moved out west. So he's working on an oil rig in Alberta, and one of the most ingenious undercover operations I've seen. And this is not a big federal, Mr. Big sting. This is a municipal police department put this project together. It was a two-wave or a two-phase, basically, takedown. They send one undercover out posing as an oil rig worker to get to know this guy. So they start working together. They start drinking and doing dope together. They start going out together. And he earns this killer's trust. And as far as the killer's aware, this guy's just another guy from Ontario, on Ontario transplant, looking to make some quick money in Alberta. The second phase, they send out a second undercover posing as a private investigator looking for the mother and the teenage daughter. And he starts calling and harassing, saying, well, you were to the killer, you were the last person seen with them. You were seen at their house. The neighbors confirmed this. And the killer says to the other undercover cop, who's wearing a wire, of course, he says, you know what, I've had enough of this guy. I'm going to kill him. And the first undercover says, yeah, you're full of it. You could never do something like that. And he says, oh, yeah? And then outlines the entire story of what happened. But here's the bottom line. This woman had a job. She had friends. She had a hairstylist. The teenage girl was in school. She was on teams. She had a doctor. She had a dentist. These people vanished, and nobody ever did anything. Nobody made a call. If two people like that can be the missing, anyone can be.
And looking at this chart, this is data collected from the Murder Accountability Project. And of course, it is in specific clusters. So this isn't all the data. This is one example of a chart that they can generate. But these are all uncleared cases in clusters that have similarities in MO or signature, or probably more advanced terminology that actual criminologists use. But for each individual story, like the one you're telling us, these are clusters. Now, that's scary. People see this here, okay? And I think you can probably guess when there's a circle and it has colors, those might be connected. I think we can figure that out. So In your book, you talk about how bad the problem is with cold cases, how bad the problem is that there are so many of them not being solved. Of course, we have our own here in London, but they are everywhere. And then you talk about why this is a problem. And I want to ask you, when someone commits a murder and they get away with it, how much more likely are they to reoffend?
Well, it depends on the nature of the murder. I mean, there's some very good research, and this is why, by the way, the Toronto Police released the name and photo of Calvin Hoover, even though he's long since dead, as the killer of Christine Jessup. Number one, as a public service, and number two, knowing full well there will be other victims out there for related crimes that they can probably now clear, that they've got a name and a face to go with. There's some excellent research, Canadian research, from a criminologist at SFU, who has obtained unrivaled access to the federal penitentiary inmate population here in Canada, and has done a number of psychometric tests with them, and has basically said, in this peer-reviewed research, that child sex offenders have the highest recidivism or repeat offending rate of any known offender. Child sexual murderers, even more so, approximately 7 to 8 times the reoffending rate of other violent criminals. So absolutely, when you see a case such as the Jessup case, or so many of these London cases, there will be others where there is one. There's no question. And just to be clear, what we're looking at here at murder accountability, and you can go to this site, it's publicly searchable at murderdata.org, and you can put in certain criteria, and it will scan our database of about 1 million murders, and you'll get these clusters that pop up. So I'm not sure what input parameters that you submitted to get this particular pattern.
It was Google Images.
Oh, okay. Well, in the book, I have the full one, which is about, and both coasts light up, there's about 2,500 clusters in the U.S. The most notable being in Atlanta, Georgia, suburban Maryland, Prince George County, Maryland, and then along the Chicago and the Northeast Seaboard. So what you're seeing here is every time there's a dot or yeah, we'll call it a dot, I guess. Those are 2 or more cases believed to be connected based on our software. So an algorithm we have crawls these 1 million murders every day and finds these patterns. When you see these pie graphs like that, you're looking at multiple patterns or clusters in the same county. So you've got multiple offenders operating concurrently. The most compelling one of these right now is a set of 51 strangulations in Chicago since 2000. All almost identical MO in every case, unknown to police until our software picked it up, because they're just far enough in space and time and in different precincts that nobody ever connected the dots until our software did. So there's now an FBI task force in Chicago to look into our cluster, and it's the basis for the speaking of true crime, but tasteful, upmarket true crime. The true crime series, The Hunt for the Chicago Strangler on Investigation Discovery. It's a 4-part limited series where I'm one of the experts. You can probably get it on demand, but this is the most recent deep dive into this case, which the conventional media is not following up on.
So a civilian body found this information?
Absolutely. Like I said, the most important homicide database is on a home server in a closet in Alexandria, Virginia.
It's interesting. The law is conservative and slow to change for a reason, right? We don't want our laws to be constantly changing and shifting around. But it does take, it seems to me, an absurdly long time for what's considered now established science to find its way into law enforcement, to become practice. Now, you're part of, and you've done this in London. We know you have had you have your cold case squad at Western. Obviously, you've done your own cold case investigations here in London. We've read about it. Thank you for the work. But you're working now more formally with a group in the United States. And the goal, of course, is to have civilians, and not just web sleuths, okay, but people who are experts, people who are scientists, forensic scientists, criminologists, people who have advanced degrees in sociology and psychology, who can take a look at historic cold cases that simply are not being worked on for many, many reasons, which we could get into. That's a whole other topic. Tell me what you think these civilian groups can do, and what's happening. How's that going?
Well, we've had a very recent major development in that area. So the Murder Accountability Project, we essentially approached 2 U.S. senators, one from the Democratic Party, one from the Republican Party, because we wanted this to be a bipartisan bill. And essentially, we called it in draft form. This is back under the Trump presidency. We called it the Homicide Victims Rights Act. The Homicide Victims Families Rights Act. And as recently as a month ago, under the Biden administration, this is now enacted into law federally in the United States. So it carried forward and is now law.
Amazing.
Whereby, if a case is dormant after 5 years, the family of a victim of a homicide can file a motion in state court to have a judge order a second agency, approved, vetted agency of the family's choosing to have full access to the file. The police no longer get to retain and have full access to the file.
Fantastic. That's really incredible. That's really incredible. Because they're just sitting in a filing cabinet, right?
In many cases, yeah. And again, it's the multiplicity of, we don't even know how many police departments exist in the United States, and we know this at murderdata.org, because we'll go and scrape coast to coast, or we'll pull the FBI's data and we'll see some new parish in Louisiana is reporting a murder for the first time in history. This parish was just created through gerrymandering like a month ago, and there's a sheriff and a deputy there now. So we don't know how many police departments there are. So it is impossible to say this is the common trend in terms of investigating cold cases in the United States, because there just is no consistency in anything, including keeping standard numbers year to year of what your police departments are doing or where they're located.
And I do have to ask, because I'm sure I'm not the only person who thought of it. If you do watch Mindhunter, which is an amazing show, and if you're in this talk, you're probably someone who enjoys crime stories. Of course, it tells the story of John Douglas and the development of the Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI. There's this amazing scene that is very memorable where he's talking to Ed Kemper, and he asks how many like him are out there. And Ed Kemper says, I don't know, 35, 40. And of course, this makes the John Douglas character's jaw just completely drop. Like, you're telling me that there are 35 or 40 serial killers out there right now that we haven't caught? But that looks like more than 35, Mike.
Yep. Well, and these are largely stationary killers. So killers offending in the same census metropolitan area, so a city or county. This does not include the 450 or so profiles that the FBI has on its Highway Serial Killing Initiative database, which is multi-jurisdictional, multi-state killers. So you add it all up, and it's probably around 2,500 to 3,000 active currently.
Let's fund the mental health initiatives here in Canada. Can we do that, please? And maybe help support children with education and safety in their homes, so we can prevent these people from being created? That would be wonderful, right? All right, that's really scary. So when it comes to private individuals like ourselves, okay, most of us don't have a degree in criminology. Most of us are not forensic scientists. Most of us aren't, psychologists with 3 PhDs who can work on this kind of a thing. What can we as individuals do to help with this, honestly, what is a crisis in cold case solve rates? I mean, what can we do to help?
This is going to sound controversial, but the easiest thing everybody can do now, because the science is changing by the week, is take a home genealogy test and upload it to GED Match.
So get your genes tested and upload it to GED Match. Now, I've done this, and I bought genetic testing kits for my family members as well, so that they would do this for Christmas, which they found very anticlimactic, and I think they were disappointed. They were like, "Oh, for Christmas, you want me to spit in a tube? Thanks, Vanessa." But Mike, can you tell us, why is this so important? What does GED Match? What does this do?
or let me go back further. And again, I think I'm pretty good at unpacking this in clear language so people understand. In 1999, the National DNA Data Bank, owing to the 1998 DNA Identification Act, went live in Canada. And what this is a massive data bank that compares DNA recovered from crime scenes, so bodily fluids, hair, etc., to convicted offenders, people who have been processed into the system and upon conviction have had their DNA taken and put into that data bank. So there are so many cases, thousands, where every 24 hours when the system resets itself, the crime scene sample, the code assigned to the crime scene sample has nothing to bounce off. There's no convicted offender coming in on the other end to make that match, to close the loop. This is now what they're calling legacy DNA technology, because as well as that system worked for so many years, and I relied on it heavily as a police officer, particularly in certain types of crimes, where you get multi-scene matches to offenders who just were arrested and processed in yesterday, and we've already linked them to, say, 7 or 8 scenes. What we're seeing is there's all kinds of reasons why an offender may never end up in the what we call convicted offender index, or that side of the data bank. Again, dying off, moving to outside of North America. So CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which is basically the operating system that runs this data bank, is a US-Canadian initiative. Again, incarcerated, they missed their window when this legislation sort of came into effect, and maybe were serving time in the late 90s, processed out in the mid-2000s, and haven't offended since, but were perhaps prolific offenders before they were, including murderers or sexual murderers before they were arrested. There's all kinds of explanations, which is why then now familial DNA, or forensic genealogy, what they're now calling genomics for short, this is the sort of branded term, is changing everything. So people know about this, that this was used to solve the Golden State Killer case most famously, and this is really what allowed it to pick up speed. It's what allowed Toronto police, after the murder of Christine Jessup was ordered into their custody from the Durham Regional Police, who screwed it up. It was used by them to identify Calvin Hoover. So one case is solved with a deceased offender, one case is solved with a live offender, D'Angelo, who was properly arrested and charged and pled guilty. But what this does is essentially, instead of looking at convicted offenders to compare crime scene samples to, you look at the entire population, or at least a representative sample of the entire population. And yes, has an offender spit in a tube and probably sent their genetic information to a private lab? Probably not. Has someone distantly related to them done that in good faith, genuinely interested, probably unaware that they're related by blood to somebody who's done stuff like this? That's how that works. And what GED Match is some people do Ancestry, some people do 23andMe, and what those companies will do is say, this is your area of origin. I was shocked to learn, despite having a German last name, I'm 99.something% Irish Scottish, which explains other things. But so 23andMe will say, you're related to these other people who took 23andMe, and Ancestry will say, you're related to these other people. Well, it's only looking at people who took those tests. What GED Match does is allow you get a card with your results to upload your information, and it compares to every home kit. So now you're widening the net, and on GED Match is millions of samples of people who are connected to millions of other people. And after Golden State, after that case, when people realized law enforcement was using this, there is an opt-out button if you're using GED Match. Say, no, you don't want law enforcement to access your genetic information. But I would contend that, again, labs like Othram Inc. in Houston, Texas, and the Texas Woodlands have already preserved so many millions of samples that if they shut the site down tomorrow, it's already too late. They've already got enough to work with. And the other difference is they're working with nanograms of DNA versus like micrograms. You bump up against somebody in passing, so like that would be enough for them to test and link you through your family tree to a crime. They don't need pools of bodily fluids. They don't need, again, the types of large, robust samples required for CODIS to make a match.
So this is where I want to bring us, and I notice we're going over time, and I apologize, everybody. If Josh will let me, I'll still take questions, but I just want to wrap up with our London cases, of course. We know that there was some DNA testing done in the year 2000. Of course, communication with law enforcement is pretty slim for anyone who's not in a uniform, so who knows what they've been doing. But a lot of these cases have DNA. Not all of them do. And of course, these are the London victims that I wrote about in Forest City Killer, and these are our unsolved cases. So we have Donna Alcock. Oh, George is solved. I put her in there as a pretty strong hint as to who I think did most of these. Bruce Stapleton, Jackie Dunleavy, Scott Leishman, Helga Beer, Soraya O'Connell, Linda White, Jackie English, and Frankie Jensen, of course. So these are all unsolved cases from London in the 1960s. How reliable is the DNA testing that would have been done in the year 2000? Should it be done again?
It would be reasonably reliable, and certainly there was convictions rendered on the basis of how reliable it was. The difference being, again, that you needed sizable samples. And I will say this, London police showed tremendous foresight in preserving physical evidence back to the 50s, thinking maybe one day this would all be useful. In CODIS, again, the Combined DNA Index System, the conventional police DNA data bank, I believe, as far as I can tell, the oldest crime scene sample still being tested daily when the system resets itself is from 1956, the murder of Susan Cadeau here in London on York Street. So someone in 1956 had the presence of mind to preserve her clothing, and it's been preserved since then, all the way to 98, when they started going through and finding exhibits that would be suitable for upload to the data bank. So it's worked consistently, it's worked well, it's had its technical limitations, but again, it's a product of government groupthink. This is not a renegade cowboy molecular scientist with a PhD, like who runs Othram Inc. and has all these trade secrets and patented secret methods that they're using to if you follow them on social media, they solve a cold case and identify probably 3 unidentified sets of human remains a week. They solve probably 3 to 5 cases a week.
Wow. Okay. So
all these, I'm looking at these right now, 3 of these could be solved within a week at Othram. It's strictly a matter of resources and of the willingness of police. And as far as I know, in Canada, departments tend to use a competing lab known as Parabon Nanolabs. Most recently with some controversy in Edmonton, because what it does is reverse engineers what the person probably looked like. So it creates a computer-generated composite, which obviously is fraught with issues. We don't know how they wore their hair. We don't know if they lost an eye. We don't know if they have a tattoo on their face. We don't know any of that. But that for about $4,000 will give you the bloodline, the country of origin for the family, and what they likely looked like. Othram is a little bit more, but again, I think it's money well spent. And to date, the Toronto Police Service is the only Canadian police service I know that has used Othram versus Parabon.
So about how much would it cost, say, to have the Jackie English or the Donna Alcock DNA sample processed for familial genealogy? At
Othram, it depends. They have 3 separate processes that can be applied depending on the degradation of the sample, depending on the age of the case, and again, depending on, I think, cost and what the budget is. But if we're using Parabon's $4,000, $4,500 baseline to get the process started, I would say if you double it, that would be within range. So, is that outrageous for considering how resources in other areas are used?
So, and that's in American dollars, right?
US dollars.
Okay, so like what, $15,000 Canadian?
Give or take.
Okay, so I think we could raise that.
Other than, it's not just a matter of the money, it's a matter of the police service has to allow Othram access to the CODIS sample. And this is where the red tape comes in. But again, I think you were going to see other cases solved in Toronto in the next 12 months using this system, and then police services are competitive. If somebody else is doing this and eating their lunch, they're going to want to get on board before it's too late. So hopefully this sets, I think, a new benchmark.
Wow. Well, Mike, here in London, we have our own examples of how destructive it is for a community to have unsolved cold cases. Of course, whoever perpetrated these crimes went on to commit more crimes outside of the London area. So I want to wrap up just by saying that your book is fantastic. I hope everyone buys it and reads it because it really is good. Talking about these issues, there are stories of true crimes in there for you to, indulge your morbid fascination. But really, we are talking about a large issue that affects so many different aspects of our Canadian society. And we really do need to see a change. So thank you for the work that you do, Mike, and thank you for the book you've written. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Are you going to do questions? Okay. What we're going to do is, if you do have questions you want to ask, please come up to us in the line. We're happy to talk to you. But I think out of respect for the festival, we'll stop here. Yeah? Sure. How about 3? Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to have 3 questions. Okay, so first hand that went up is at the back, and I think is a festival volunteer. Just shout it. Oh, she's moving the camera. This is the trouble with, getting a question from a volunteer. They actually have to do work at the festival, too. I think you should definitely read Murder City. Okay, so the question was, how do you know, what did you learn about serial killers? Who are they? How do they become who they are? What are their different traits? That is a very big question. We could definitely speak another hour about, but what I'd like to do is refer you to Murder City, which discusses a lot of paraphilias and profiling topics. You'd also, if you want to get serious about it, Sexual Homicide by Robert Ressler, Ann Burgess, and John Douglas is a fantastic place to start. But essentially, we need to take care of our children, I'd say, is the number one thing, and make sure they have a safe place, that their mental health issues are addressed, and that they aren't traumatized as kids. I'd say that's the number one thing we need to do. Next question. There's one behind you, sorry. Yes.
Typically, like we saw in the Grizel case, intense lobbying by the family, saying is essentially providing substantive evidence to the contrary, whether it's undetermined or accidental or suicide, that negates that being possible, and getting the ear of a seasoned officer who says, yeah, there is some merit to what they're saying, and maybe the most convenient or logical explanation isn't always the correct one. Occam's razor doesn't always apply. So it's usually intuition and gumption from either the investigator and or the family, or more frequently, the revelation of new evidence.
I'd agree with Mike in that I think what helps officers put these things together is often, especially with the cold cases, is families pushing for answers. I think particularly of the Linda White case. Linda's right here behind me, who went missing in 1968. And of course, the police just thought she had run away. And I think they would have continued to think that until they found her in 1973, if it wasn't for all of the other cases, because she was early in the series, and then all of these other cases happened afterwards. And then the Ontario Provincial Police, who were actually trained in homicide, noticed a pattern. But yeah, I think families advocating, and some families just don't want to, and that's their prerogative. But I would definitely say that that's the number one way that police are pushed to find those connections. Yes, last question.
What can Canadian civilians do to help initiate or push for more information on that?
So the question was, what can Canadian civilians do to help and push for more? I mean, obviously, you can talk to your member of parliament. and you're a provincial member of parliament as well, and that's always helpful. I've done that. The truth is that government and policing are separate for a reason, and that's in a democracy to prevent things like a military coup. So those walls are up for a reason. But what Mike mentioned about getting your genetic testing done and submitting it to GED Match, I think is really helpful. And aside from that, it's creating awareness.
And there's nothing to stop a Homicide Victims Families Rights Act bill from being tabled in Canada. I mean, how far would it make it? With our lame duck politicians, I don't know. But all that starts with a phone call to in Canada with the three main parties, MPs on all three sides of the aisle, and see if you can get a bipartisan agreement on that.
You're looking at two people who have gone down these rabbit holes, and I mean, we do stuff that we don't share, and there are meetings that happen that the public doesn't find out about, and there's a really high burnout rate with people who work on cold cases because it becomes incredibly frustrating. I see fellow sleuths here in this room, some who have been working on London's cold cases for 15, 20 years. So not everyone has the fortitude. So if you're someone who is enthusiastic and feels like you have the energy, take something on like that, There's work that you can look up what they're doing in the States and see what can I do to make that happen here. And the truth is, if anyone wants change, they just have to do it. So, all right. So we're going to head out before you. And, here's Josh. He'll tell you what to do. I don't have to tell you anymore.
Yeah, well, first of all, before that, as Michael and Vanessa go upstairs to the second floor, right across from where the bookstore is, and you can buy a book and get it signed if you'd like, or talk to the authors in the line. I would like to thank both of them for such a wonderful afternoon conversation, and thank you all for coming.